Welcome to the webinar brought to you by Orchard Technologies. Orchard Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing products. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy-to-administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. Oral-based testing products provide a simplified collection process that results cost savings with minimal risk of tampering and dramatically reduced risk of adulteration. The Intercept Oral Fluid Drug Test is an FDA-cleared laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate testing for 9 drugs of abuse, including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, methadone, and opiates. It has the #1 recognized brand name in oral fluid testing in a 2014 National Drug Testing Industry Survey. With a fast and easy-to-administer collection process, Intercept is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, drug treatment centers, the clinical setting screening programs, among others. Today's presentation is entitled, What You Should Know About the Lab-Based Oral Fluid Testing Guidelines Proposed by SAMHSA, and will be presented by Bill Current. Bill is the president of the Current Consulting Group, a national consulting firm that specializes in drug testing policy development and helping employers optimize their employee screening program. He's editor of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com. He also publishes the e-newsletter State Drug Testing Laws Monthly. Mr. is the former executive director of the American Council for Drug Education and served as vice president of consulting for a national third-party administrator of drug testing and background screening services. He's the author or co-author of 10 books on substance abuse issues, including Why Drug Testing. He also administers the annual Drug Testing Industry Survey, now in its 17th year, the results of which will be presented at the SAPA conference in September 2015. It will now be our pleasure to hear from Bill Current.
Well, welcome to everyone who is on today's webinar. We have a real big turnout. We suspected there would be a lot of interest in the proposed guidelines from SAMHSA on lab-based oral fluid testing, and the registration for today's webinar seemed to bear that out. We have a lot of folks on the line, so welcome to everybody. First, I'd like to just thank Orchard Technologies for hosting their monthly webinar series every month. Without fail, they host a webinar on a very timely and hot topic of concern to people in the drug testing industry, as well as those who use drug testing services. Of course, today's presentation topic is something Orchard Technologies, as well as companies, have been very involved in the last several months, working with the Drug Testing Advisory Board and with SAMHSA, finally bring to the public these proposed guidelines. So our hats off to Orchard Technologies for the effort, as well as for hosting today's webinar. Right now is the overview that came with the invitation to today's presentation. I just want to point out that the proposed guidelines that came out from SAMHSA were hundreds of pages. I think 200 pages in the Federal Register, and we condensed them down to about a 45, 50-minute webinar presentation today. So there's a ton of information in those proposed guidelines, a lot more than we can cover today. I've got 45 slides, and anybody who is on today's webinar, if you would like the slides, Jessica's going to send you information in the next 24 hours on how you can access the slides and how you can access a recording of today's webinar presentation. We invite you to, get those and use them yourself and study them yourself. But if you want to really get into the weeds on this thing, get those guidelines. You'll find hundreds of pages of really interesting information. Work about just a few key issues today. We're going through the basics of the proposed guidelines. And I want to share with you some very interesting information from SAMHSA, where they project the market share that lab-based oral fluid testing will eventually capture once these guidelines go into effect, once they're finalized. And also, they project where the market may go if DOT also adopts the guidelines, which we believe that they will. Then, if you've ever been on one of the webinars that I've done on lab-based oral fluid testing. You know I'm a proponent of drug testing, of course. I believe in all forms of drug testing as long as they're done right. But I've been a proponent of lab-based oral fluid testing for many years, and it goes back to some early influences in my career. And you've heard about those benefits, the benefits of lab-based oral fluid testing. Well, what I'm going to share with you today, I have taken out of those proposed guidelines. So in the words of the federal government, of the Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration, I'm going to share with you the benefits according to the federal government in their own words. And this is why they adopted the developing regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing. They came to the conclusion that these are the benefits, and this would be good for employers in the federal government to have. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how state laws are affected or may be affected by these guidelines once they become finalized, and then sort of where we go from here. I go through this, so keep in mind that there's a lot of material. We're only going to be able to cover part of it here today. Some of it I'm going to sort of gloss over a little bit, and some of it I'm going to go into more specifics, okay? Back, the Federal Register came out just before the DAISHA conference, actually, just a couple of weeks before DAISHA, where they published the proposed guidelines in the Federal Register from SAMHSA for lab-based oral fluid testing. Guidelines, as presented, would apply to federal agencies, to test federal employees working for federal agencies. These guidelines, as they're presently constituted, would necessarily be for T or for NRC, etc. But this would be for testing federal workers. Gives federal agencies, or would eventually, once these are finalized, would give federal agencies the opportunity to choose an alternative testing method besides urine testing to test federal workers who are in drug testing programs. But the foundation upon DOT regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing will be based. And I'm going to share a little bit more on that with you momentarily. Really, they have standards and technical requirements for oral fluid collection devices. By that, I don't mean on-site oral fluid testing devices, but the devices that are used to collect oral fluid samples that will then be sent to a laboratory. Establish criteria for initial drug tests, or confirmatory drug tests, again with oral fluid through a laboratory, and the processes of review by medical review officers, and specific requirements that apply to federal agencies and what they can do, potential testing with oral fluid samples through a laboratory. A lot of copy here, and you're going to get these slides if you want them. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but I want to point out certain highlights before we get into sort of the big issues. The guidelines provide flexibility, according to the federal government, for federal agency workplace testing programs. Again, it removes the requirement to collect only a urine sample and makes it possible for federal agencies that have drug testing programs to also collect a urine sample instead or in conjunction with. Okay? All standards that apply to federal agencies right now when it comes to workplace drug testing programs are still in effect and will remain in effect. This is just adding to those standards that already exist. And when you acronym OFG, that's for oral fluid mandatory guidelines. But this is an interesting statement that was right there in the preamble. These proposed oral fluid mandatory guidelines provide the same scientific and forensic supportability of results as the mandatory guidelines for federal workplace drug testing programs using urine, or the URMC, MG. In other words, they use that terminology. Scientific and forensic supportability. That's how strongly the federal government, SAMHSA, is in support of lab-based oral fluid testing now. There's no sort of gap, no light between the two testing methods, urine and oral fluid. And of course, that stands to reason. They would not have gone to all of this trouble if they weren't absolutely convinced that lab-based oral fluid testing meet all of the standards that were currently in place with urine testing programs. Now, as I mentioned, these guidelines, as currently constituted, instituted, at least initially, will apply only to federal workplace programs. Some agencies, and this is a quote from the proposed guidance, sub-agencies such as the Department of Transportation are required to follow these guidelines in developing drug testing programs for their regulated industries, whereas other agencies, such as the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, use guidelines as part of the regulatory basis for their federal drug testing programs. Again, interesting statement there. I've got Patrice Kelly's name coming up here. Everybody in the drug testing industry knows Patrice Kelly, the director of ODAPSI, and my favorite people in the industry as well. Just presented at the DAISHA conference. A lot of information was presented. Some part of it, a small part of it, had to do with the proposed guidelines for lab-based oral fluid testing, but it has been widely accepted that once SAMHSA finalizes the guidelines for federal programs use or federal agencies to use lab-based oral fluid testing, that DOT will then move to develop regulations specific to DOT-mandated drug testing programs. Now, Patrice didn't exactly commit to that, but her tone was very optimistic, and I think most people expect that to happen. At a point, sure, employers stated to do drug testing under the federal DOT regulations, drug and alcohol testing regulations, we permitted to choose between the traditional urine testing that's always been in place and the lab-based oral fluid testing that is now part of the proposed guidelines from SAMHSA. In a nutshell, have to do with the collection process. Of course, there's a lot in there about observed collections, about split specimens, and the different ways in which oral fluid samples can be collected. And then, the split specimen requirement that's currently in Part 40. Department SAMHSA is proposing that all specimens be tested for, and I beg forgiveness of my folks on the scientific side of this, but I've practiced these words in preparation for today, but albumin and immunoglobulin, and I know my good friend Ryan Feely from Orsher is probably cringing as I said those. I apologize. But I'm determining the validity of the specimen. So specimen validity is written into these guidelines as well. And you're going to find that if you take the time to read through the 200 pages of proposed guidelines, there's a lot of correlation between the existing guidelines and these proposed guidelines for oral fluid testing. Some of the terminology and methodology is going to be different, deal with oral fluid versus urine, but the processes are intended to bring about the same results. As I go forward, if I run into some more words that I have trouble with, I'm just going to skip them, okay? Now, let's talk about some specific areas and get into a little bit of detail here. If you're familiar with oral fluid testing, you know that there are really basically two types of oral fluid collection devices. One deals with expectorant, and the expectorant process, okay, that's collecting an undiluted or often referred to as a neat oral fluid sample. And second is from some type of an absorbent pad, okay, and you often hear putting a cotton swab in your mouth. It's not exactly that, okay, but you've seen collection devices where you're a swab of some sort into the mouth and it begins to absorb oral fluid from the oral cavity. Those are basically the two different methods, and as you see the second book there, this is again a quote from the proposed guidelines. The department is recommending that all collection devices maintain the integrity of the specimen during collection, storage, and transport to the laboratory for testing. Of course, they're not picking one or the other necessarily, but saying that it has to meet the same type of integrity requirements that currently exist for urine testing going forward. And keep in mind, and I may have mentioned this at the very beginning, but we're right in the middle of a 60-day public comment period. So these guidelines have gone out. Now people in the industry have the opportunity to comment, to make recommendations, suggestions, to voice complaints, whatever, in a written format submitted to SAMHSA, and there'll be a time in which those are reviewed. So if you had a preference, different types of collection devices that are available, the different collection methods that you may be familiar with, you can actually write to SAMHSA and include those in some type of comment that you would like to submit to the government on any portion of one of those proposed guidelines. The guidelines say, quote, all devices must have, and I've broken that out into these 4 bullets, indicator that demonstrates the adequacy of the volume of the collected specimen, so a volume indicator, sealed non-leaking container, we all want that, right, and the components that ensure pre-analytical drug and drug metabolite stability. So behind that, there's some science, of course, but the components, as it says in the 4th bullet, there does not substantially affect the composition of the drugs and drug metabolites in the oral fluid specimen. So the device components can't get away or in any way affect the integrity of the sample. And so an indicator, a full non-leaking container, and the science behind the collection device itself to absolutely 100% protect the sample. The proposed specimen collection device should collect either a minimum of 1 milliliter of undiluted oral fluid specimen, that oral fluid, or down sort of in the middle, the volume of oral fluid collected should be within 0.1 milliliter of the target volume if we're looking at a collection device that is not collecting a neat specimen. So if you're looking at the 2 different perspectives there, and really the thing to take away from this information, and there's more explanation in the proposed guidelines, is that, and it really impressed me. We knew this was coming, of course, but we kept across for a long time as an industry before we really saw results from SAMHSA, back in the middle of May, which is, as you read the proposed guidelines, and this is just what in front of you on the screen right now is just a very condensed version of this section of the proposed guidelines, which the amount of detail that went into the writing of these proposed guidelines are involved in that process, of course, and some very, very smart people whom are very active in our industry, others more behind the scenes on the scientific side of it. As you go to guidelines themselves, if you take the time, and I'm sure some of you on today's call have done that, you're to be impressed with the amount of detail they went into, and it reflects the fact that this process has been a many months long process with a lot of people having input into that process. Read the guidelines, you quickly sort of ascertain that not everybody in the drug testing industry is going to like this or that. Can't fault SAMHSA for the that they've included here, because it really reflects, I think, a genuine effort to try to get this right from the very beginning, and that's in part why it took many months to do that. The department that a split specimen be collected, of course, it's part of the regs now, and 2 specimens collected simultaneously or serially with 2 separate collection devices, or collected with a collection device that subdivides the specimen into 2 separate collection tubes. So 2 samples that would be collected simultaneously or serially from 2 different devices, or 1 device in which it would have the ability to subdivide the specimen into 2 separate collection tubes. Now, the here in quotes. If collected serially, collection of the second specimen must begin within 2 minutes after completion of the first collection. You can see how it was trying to deal with some of the common issues here that are sort of over the course of 20 years in the urine mandatory guidelines that have to match up somewhat, kind of side by side with oral fluid testing. And so how do you do a split specimen with oral fluid? Especially keep in mind that there are many state laws that require a split specimen, they may not specifically say oral fluid testing is permitted because the law in a particular state may have been written 15, 20 years ago before a lot of serious people were thinking about oral fluid testing. But if you're fluid testing in that state, according to that state's law, all testing methods must include a split specimen. Well, that's reflected in the DOT regulations as well in Part 40. And with this inclusion of a new testing method, new in that it's in addition to urine testing, it has up. Again, some of the terminology, some of the science behind it is going to be different, but it's going to look the same. It's got to include the same processes that protect the integrity of the overall sample as well as the ultimate result of the test. And you do that when you're dealing with the different specimen in oral fluid. And this is, again, just a portion of what's in the proposed guidelines on this topic, but it's what they're proposing. Okay. Last sentence, the department believes this allows sufficient time for the collector to begin the second specimen collection in a time manner to minimize differences in oral fluid collected using two separate collection devices. So again, they've thought this through. This is a recommending. Again, these are proposals, right? And have the opportunity to comment on that process. Interesting. The Transportation Employee Testing Act, which governs DOT-regulated testing programs as well as the FAA's Federal Employee Testing Program, requires that collected specimens must be able to be subdivided to allow additional testing upon request of the employee. We sometimes call that a confirmatory test or a retest. Therefore, the department, part of these proposed guidelines, requests comment on this process. Which collection method and split specimen method do you prefer, or which one makes the most sense to you? What do you have a problem with, one or the other? This is your opportunity to comment on it. And based on comments that come in, and there'll probably be several months of review of the comments, that he's going to make some final decisions, and those final lines will someday come out. You might be with them, but at least if you comment on them now, you will have done your part to try to influence the process, and you'll have nothing, if you don't do that, you'll have nothing to complain about when they do come out and you're unhappy with them. So when it comes to some more complex issues like split specimens or collection processes, et cetera, a lot of the stuff I don't have in here. You need to comment on it. There's still time to do that. Now, the proposed add additional drugs are included in the proposed guidelines. And if you follow the National Survey on Drug Use and Health that comes out every year from SAMHSA, you've last several years that the family of psychotherapeutic drugs has jumped into second place among all the drug categories of abuse. So marijuana is by far still number one, and that's a good subject for another webinar, and I've done many on that topic. The family of psychotherapeutic drugs are number two. Pain relievers, tranquilizers, stimulants, sedatives, all combined are the two categories of drug abuse in the United States. And as there in that last sentence of the first bullet, the use of narcotic pain relievers has become a serious and growing public health concern. One of the things I always talk to employers when we're writing policies for them is, are you about having a drug-free workplace? If you're serious about it, then you need to test for the drugs that people are using. So look at the second bullet there. Many are derived from opium but are synthetic analogs. Oxycodone and hydrocodone top the list of narcotic pain relievers causing visits to hospital emergency room departments due to the non-medical use of these drugs. In the bullet is a quote. I should have put quotes around it. Because the prevalence of their abuse, hydrocodone and oxycodone have been included in the proposed oral fluid mandatory guidelines. That's very significant and important. This is also important. Hydrocodone metabolizes in the body to hydromorphone, and it's excreted through biological fluids, okay, of the hydrocodone and is subject to abuse and addiction. And because oxycodone metabolizes in the body to oxymorphone, excuse me. No, excuse me, I've got it right there. And it's same potential for hydromorphone and oxymorphone are also included in the proposed oral fluid mandatory guidelines. So to take a step back, hydrocodone and oxycodone have been included in the proposed guidelines. It's hydromorphone and oxymorphone. So a lot of good information in the proposed guidelines on that subject. I just condensed it down to 2 slides very quickly. Something to be aware. Now we're going to look at what the federal government has said about sort of projecting the future. How many oral fluid tests do they really expect to place once the federal agencies have that as an option? Okay, and keeping in mind the proposed lines as they've been presented only affect federal agencies that have workplace drug testing programs. So, and let me do first bullet. To project annual number of oral fluid test specimens by federal agencies, SAMHSA used data obtained from the Federal Workplace Drug Testing Program and HHS certified laboratories. Now, based on their annual number of 150,000 tests of federal agencies testing their employees, they project that about 7%, just over 10,000, will be fluid specimens. The rest of them remaining urine specimens. So they're only projecting that, at least initially, only 7% of all federal drug tests, 150,000, will convert to oral fluid tests. Now, then they kind of went outside of the federal government and did options for DOT and NRC. Right now, using numbers provided by the federal government, the total number of regulated specimens for DOT is 6 million, and for NRC is about 200,000. This, quote, should DOT and NRC allow oral fluid testing in regulated industries, workplace programs, the estimated annual numbers of specimens for DOT would be 180,000 oral fluid, with 5.8 million plus remaining with urine, and specimens for NRC would be 14,000 oral fluid and 186,000 remaining with urine. So, pretty relatively small percentage converting to oral fluid testing. Let's take a look on this next slide. The trend of the testing of fluids will be gradual and steady over the course of 4 years. When in tow. This is again the federal government make this estimation. But it is expected oral fluid tests will account for 25 to 30% of all related drug testing. This estimate regulated sector's time, core testing of oral fluid and urine in the past 4 years. This would correlate to 1.7 million to just over 1.9 million specimens per year. And I think the federal government projecting somewhere between 25 and 30% is perhaps low, but let's stick with that number, okay? We, at our company, the Kern Consulting Group, that right now there are about 50 million drug tests performed in the United States every year, and probably, and this is a much harder figure to estimate, but probably about the same amount throughout the rest of the world. I call today are probably shaking their heads, but that's what we've come up with. Now, we survey of the drug testing industry every year here in the United States, and we've done, as Jessica mentioned, this will be our 17th annual survey. We do an international survey of drug testing. This year will be our 3rd annual international drug testing survey. So part of our estimates come from that effort. Now, with SAMHSA's estimate of 25 to 30%, using that 50 million, that would be approximately 12.5 to 15 million lab-based oral fluid tests using those numbers. Now, I'm right at the halfway mark. Go to this next slide. I'm going to tell you a little story. Many years ago, when I started the Kern Consulting Group, which back in those days was called WFC and Associates, I had a client. A gentleman had been in the drug testing business since sort of inception. Very smart guy. I actually felt like I was learning more from him than he was getting from me as his consultant. But one of my very earliest drug testing industry surveys, I did the first one in 1999, and it was around 2000, 2001. I asked him, because he was a big fan of oral fluid testing, and back then he was talking about instant oral fluid testing. But at the time, you're such a fan of oral fluid testing. How many of all tests do you think will someday be oral fluid? What percentage of the market will switch to oral fluid testing? If you're such a fan, you really believe in it. And he's 80%. Now, that was projecting, I think the total industry represented somewhere around 35 to 40 million drug tests a year. So I did the math, of course. I asked a bunch of other people, and most people were right around 10%, 15%. The most ambitious were around 20%. This person was at 80%. I asked why, and he walked me through all the reasonings for that. And I sort of tucked that away. And it was part of, what influenced me earlier in my career to be more open-minded about alternative testing methods. But even if it was 80%, my friend from 18 years ago would have probably said 25% is way too low. Now, I'm not making a prediction here, but we're looking at it on a grander scale and trying to determine who would actually be interested in switching to oral fluid testing. Who's not doing drug testing today, and why aren't they doing drug testing? Does it have something to do with urine testing? Doing urine testing, or who's not willing to incur the costs and the lost productivity that's typically associated with urine testing, like sending workers to off-site collection sites to void samples, etc. And incurring those costs now, they're interested in an alternative testing method that eliminates much of those costs, if not all of them, when it comes to certain aspects of the collection process, as well as some of the lost productivity that's commensurate with sending workers to off-site collection sites. And a step further, just trying to get a feel for who's interested in this. Keep in mind that even they're not mandated under the DOT regulations to do drug testing, still sort of defer to the federal regulations as the gold standard for drug testing. So when they don't see an alternative to urine, they assume that there isn't a good alternative. And as I'm going to talk about at the very end of the presentation, there's also state laws that defer to the federal regulations in one form or another and either require employers in mandatory programs or in voluntary programs to comply with many parts of the federal regulations. It sort of creates this aura that the regulations, Part 40, the mandatory guidelines or the DOT regulations, they get referred to in different ways, but they sort of mean the same terms in the minds of the employers, and sometimes even people in our industry who provide drug testing, that this is the gold standard and this is the way to do that. And so some companies maybe don't want to do it that way, and so they don't do drug testing at all. And others are sort of deterred costs that are involved, et cetera, in this sort of budget crunching period of time in which we live in here. So some companies are going to be perhaps more inclined to consider drug testing or to switch the drug testing method when it addresses those concerns. But important consider which is the growing trend of marijuana throughout the United States. This is an issue because mayors are very confused about the right to test for marijuana, and that the right to do anything with somebody who tests positive for marijuana when they're located in a state where marijuana is legal. Marijuana is legal recreationally, right, in Oregon, Washington, Alaska, and Colorado, and to a large extent in the District of Columbia. But there are a number of states that have legalized marijuana for medicinal purposes. Whether we'll use it medicinally or not is beside the point. It's legal under certain circumstances. Now, those state laws don't allow smoking of marijuana. Some of them are limited to THC-based oils, et cetera, and some of those laws the pro-marijuana legalization folks don't like, and others they love, et cetera, et cetera. The point is that there's a growing number of states legalizing marijuana for one purpose or another, and unfortunately, a healthy percentage of employers who are so confused by the issue that even contacted their drug testing provider to remove THC from the drug panel that they test for. And it's because in last year's survey, we asked drug testing providers, have you had any clients remove it from the drug test panel? And near 17% said that they had. So a healthy percentage of employers out there who have become so confused by the issue that they're no testing for marijuana, or they're reconsidering right now whether they should test for marijuana. And it has to do with what employers have the right to know what somebody's doing on their own free time. Especially they may be doing is legal. Like smoking cigarettes, it's legal. You allow it in your workplace, of course, but it's legal for that individual to smoke a cigarette. Well, in some states, it's legal to smoke marijuana for medicinal purposes. And so employers are confused by that as well. Here comes the oral fluid testing, unique to oral fluid testing, which is window of detection. When the urine program at the levels that we use now today, and that you can detect THC in a urine sample for days and days and weeks beyond this 3 to 4 days. But it's typically get positive results some in the 3 to 4 day range. And due respect to the scientists who are on the webinar today. But cutoff levels we use, we're really looking at a window of detection somewhere in that range, give or take a day or two. With oral testing, lab-based oral fluid testing, which correlates, in terms of accuracy, really well with the urine testing methods that are used today. We're in a relatively shorter window of detection, somewhere within hours. And somebody is suspected of being under the influence of at work, possibly marijuana. But let's in it where marijuana is legal. The lawyer really have to worry about what they were doing last night, or if I'm testing with lab-based oral fluid testing, because the window of detection is going to be within a time frame, even 24 hours, let's say, that I can be comfortable with, because I suspect the individual is under the influence. Then, with that example, I get a window of detection that pretty much fits during the time they've been at work, or can reasonably conclude that the individual is under the influence of marijuana at the time that I collected their oral fluid specimen. Again, I'm using the word impaired. I'm using the word under the term under the influence. On this point, but there are employers out there who are changed by the whole marijuana legalization issue, who knew about some of the advantages or some of the unique characteristics, let's say, of oral fluid testing, particularly as it pertains to the window of detection. They're willing to keep drug testing, or they're willing to drug test under certain circumstances with oral fluid testing rather than urine or hair, as opposed to eliminating reasonable suspicion testing or post-accident testing altogether. Now, we're going to talk bits of lab-based oral fluid testing. There's a lot of copy on many of these slides. I'm not going to read it all, I promise. What I wanted to do was give you a good feel for what the proposed guidelines say when it comes to why they decided to adopt these lab-based oral fluid testing guidelines, which are in the proposal stage right now. Everything I'm about to present on the next several slides is a direct quote from, with the exception of this slide, is a quote from those proposed guidelines. Okay, and I make the point here that they spent many, many months, a lot more people going through this, okay, before they got with these proposed guidelines, as with the accuracy, the practicality, and the legality of this additional testing method. And so I took what the proposed guidelines and sort of pared it down to specific topics. So when it came to the subject of productivity, and I just sort of jump around a little bit, but the productivity for federal agencies related to drug-free workplace programs is expected to improve. For example, administrative data indicates it takes on average about 4 hours from the point of notification of a drug test until the user is back to work. That's with the existing urine testing guidelines. With oral, because the collection does not require the same privacy concerns as urine testing, that on-site collections are likely, meaning they'll take place there at the workplace, because collection is fairly simple and an employee can be trained to administer that. We're going to reduce the time the donor is away from the work site. The estimates the time savings to be between 3 hours. So you're going to cut down from that 4 right now to somewhere between 1 and 3 hours. Well, I'm going to tell you it's going to be less than that. I mean, in every oral fluid testing program that I've been familiar with in writing policies, et cetera, you're really looking at pulling somebody off the line to provide an oral fluid sample and then, in many cases, get back to work within, a matter of 15, 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. They're estimating of between 1 and 3 hours. So, activity side. All I'm going to say about the science, because there's a lot of references to the science, and it would be fair to subject you to my mingling some of the terminology that they use in those guidelines. I recommend them, of course, to you. But I like this statement: the scientific basis for use of oral fluid as an alternative specimen for drug testing has broadly established. And so as you read those proposed guidelines, you find references to studies that have been done. And when it came to sort of coming to scientific conclusion about the use, the viability of oral fluid as a testing process, or sample, excuse me, a lot of homework on that. And so I haven't included it here. But one issue, though, and it does deal a little bit with the science as well, is the whole drug test cheating issue, the adulteration substitution issue. SAMHSA recognized that this is a significant problem when it comes to urine testing. Because of the privacy concerns, many urine samples are voided being observed, and an individual has the opportunity to add something to a specimen, to try to adulterate it, to even substitute one sample for another, et cetera, et cetera. In the third bullet, you see there that they admit that even though efforts are constantly in process to thwart these cheating efforts, that the manufacturers of these drug test cheating processes or products, have developed new products to avoid detection. So it's constantly, sort of the casing its tail sort of situation, and they recognize that. Also, very interesting in that last bullet, current research indicates that some current substitution products are indistinguishable from human urine, since urine and whatnot that is not necessarily readily distinguished in the lab analysis process. And that's a big concession for SAMHSA to make, right? Because for many years, they have only allowed the use of testing, which they admit is subject to adulteration and substitution. But they go to this, quote, oral fluid collection will occur under observation, which substantially lessen the risk of specimen substitution adulteration. And unlike the observed urine collections, the collector need not be the same gender as the donor. I have a lot of webinars as some of my associates in the industry when it comes to drug test cheating. I will tell you that it's almost comical when you go on the internet and you do some research and you're looking specifically for oral fluid drug test cheating methods. And my favorite one is from a website where the advice they can give you is to avoid giving anybody your saliva, because if you do, you're going to test positive. In other words, they can offer a product to you to mask the presence of in your oral fluid sample. So to avoid giving them a sample or abstain from drugs for some period of time, because if you're ready and you give them a sample, you're going to test positive. And a lot of information in the proposed guidelines on this, but very, very telling information. Now, when it comes to accuracy, this is interesting. So they referenced an earlier study of over 77,000 oral fluid specimens that reported similar trends in positive prevalence rates compared to the DTI of urine specimens collected during the same period. Okay, in that study, the combined positivity rate for oral fluid was 5.06% compared to 4.46% for urine. If you go to that last bullet, they suppose sort of speculate that higher positivity rate for oral fluid may have been due to the fact that the oral fluid collections were performed under observation, significantly reducing, in my words, if not eliminating, the possibility of drug test cheating. So you had a higher positivity rate with urine testing compared, or with oral fluid testing compared to urine testing. Limited studies have compared positivity rates from specimen collections in the same population. This is a continuation of the quote. A clinical study involving compliance monitoring of pain patients compared to results for oral fluid to urine specimens collected in simultaneous fashion. The specimens were analyzed for 42 drugs and or metabolites by spectrometric procedures. Now, this slide has kind of a I'm not going to read it all, but you have these results. But you can see the second bullet from the first data set, 92.4% of oral fluid and urine specimens had the same results. In the data set, which included hydrocodone and oxycodone, 89.2% had the same results. And that last bullet I put in bold to sort of emphasize this. Of course, oral fluid and urine test results have been shown to be substantially similar, and oral may have some inherent advantages at drug test specimen from the study that they were quoting. Collectivity, and I can see that we're getting a little bit tight on time. Please submit questions using the Q&A function. I'll be happy to get to any questions that you have. And questions that we can't get to today, I'll send you and answer your questions for you. Election time and productivity. The bottom line here to this section of the proposed guidelines is that an oral collection doesn't require the use of an off-site facility, doesn't necessarily require the services of a professional technician. Every collection can be observed from start to finish. You don't have to match the donor or the gender of the donor and the administrator of the test, et cetera, et cetera. And time away is lessened because many of these tests can take place in the workplace, on site. Again, I've only taken a portion of what the proposal say about that. Savings, though, this was using annual salary estimates from federal employees converted to an hourly wage, et cetera. But it's roughly a savings of $400,000 to $1.2 million a year, or $38 to $114 per test. Interesting numbers there. It does indicate, and it does provide some good information on recent use, the use indication ability and capabilities of oral fluid testing compared to urine. Oral tests generally are positive as soon as the drug is absorbed into the body. This is, among other reasons, there's science behind it, and I'm not going to attempt to explain that. I would butcher it pretty badly. But what I would say is that with lab-based oral fluid tests, you're able to detect with that oral fluid sample both the parent drug and the metabolite of the drug. Where with typical urine testing programs, you're looking at the metabolite of the drug, and as it says there in the last bullet, that the detection of a metabolite are dependent upon the rate and extent of the metabolite formation. With oral fluid, you're able to detect the real drug itself, the parent drug. That's detectable within after an individual has taken the drug. So urine, you're probably looking at maybe an process before it's detectable in a urine sample. I've heard a little bit more, I've heard a little bit less. With an oral test, though, the general consensus that, their reuse indication begins almost immediately after a person has used drugs. So that means that if somebody comes back from lunch smelling of marijuana, you're going to be able to test them, and if they really did use marijuana, it's probably going to go up in their system by the time you test them, by you collect that urine sample, that oral fluid sample. A little bit more of the same, and I'll go past that just because we're running out of time. Now, how are state laws going to be affected? And say may be affected because who knows what may happen in the future. But right now, as a sort of landscape of state drug testing laws, a lot of good sources for state drug testing laws. There are laws, there are voluntary laws, there's workers' comp laws that affect drug testing, unemployment comp laws that affect drug testing, etc. Different types of laws on basis have been, I should say the federal regulations have been used as sort of the drug testing procedural requirements in some of these state laws. What I mean to say is that there are states that simply punt on the issue of drug testing procedures and defer directly to either, quote, SAMHSA, quote, DOT, or quote, Part 40, sometimes, quote, the federal government. Sometimes laws are old. They've been around a long, long time. And laws were written, they weren't sort of anticipating alternative specimens like urine and hair. And so it doesn't really, the laws don't really contain anything about urine and hair testing, and hair testing, excuse me. But they defer to the federal regulations. And in some cases, this may sort of handcuff the employer who's doing drug testing in a particular state. It doesn't necessarily can't do oral fluid testing, but they dictate how they do oral fluid testing. We know now that there are no SAMHSA certified laboratories for oral fluid testing because there are no laboratory certification requirements right now. They will be one of the results of these guidelines once they are finalized. Right now, there is no sort of SAMHSA certified laboratory for oral fluid testing. But you have laws, state laws, that require employers to use a SAMHSA certified lab or a CAP certified lab or a lab licensed by the state or by another state like New York. New York lab licensing certification is common to see in other state laws. But if that's the case, then an employer has to comply with that. And no SAMHSA certified oral fluid testing labs now, they're stuck using a SAMHSA certified lab for urine testing, which is not a bad thing. Now, I mentioned some of these state laws are voluntary. Here in where I live, I'm not required to comply with the law, but if I do, and I can get into the program, I can get a 5% workers discount on my workers' comp premium. That state, sometimes they offer something different than a workers' comp premium discount. But Alaska, Arkansas, Georgia, Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee, voluntary laws, they simply defer to the federal regulations for certain parts of the procedures, processes of a drug test. Some have industry-specific laws, like West Virginia. West Virginia is a mining industry law. Illinois is a public works contractors law. And both of those laws defer to the federal regulations for drug testing in one way or another. There are mandatory laws, laws that require every employer in the state to comply with that law if they're going to do drug testing. Louisiana is a good example, although they do have an exemption in Louisiana for companies in the oil and gas industry. Montana, Wyoming, and the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, where certain parts of the law mandatory defer to the federal regulations. And this is an example of a state whose work comp law, SAMHSA guidelines, and released some compliance, some it be complied with in order to use a drug test result. Why am I all of this? Because when the Fed finalizes this and it becomes part of Part 40, for example, then these laws these state laws that refer to and defer to federal regulations in one name, right? SAMHSA, DOT, Part 40, etc. They automatically accept lab-based testing unless they overtly make an effort to exclude it, which is not likely. So there are now Vermont and Maine that don't allow oral fluid testing. There are that have restrictions and guidelines in place, and examples of states that refer directly to various names to federal guidelines. And once these federal guidelines come out for oral fluid testing, then these would presumably automatically allow that. And the process that become part of the final version of these proposed guidelines will become mandatory instead refer to and require compliance with the federal guidelines. That's why these proposed guidelines are very important. Yes, they only refer right now to testing of federal employees with federal agencies. They apply to DOT-covered employers who fall under the DOT drug and alcohol testing regulations. But it has far-reaching effects when it comes to the non-mandated market for drug testing. And this is something everybody, employer and drug testing provider alike, needs to be aware of and prepare for. But even though it may be my way, and the big question is, what's right? What do we do now? Regulations may be, a period of time away, many months for instance. There are companies right now, according to a survey, that are looking at alternative testing methods, particularly lab-based oral fluid testing. And we are hearing from people as part of our survey while there's not mass migration toward lab-based oral fluid testing, indicating a steady movement in that direction that would support the speculation that over the course of time, over the course of the next 3, 4, 5 years, a significant percentage of the existing market share for drug testing will be occupied by oral fluid testing, lab-based oral fluid testing, specifically because of these guidelines. So we're in the middle of a 60-day public comment period. It ends July 12th. Its public comment period ends. It will be several months, and I use that term generously, several months, in reviewing these comments, and they may at that point ask for additional comments from the public, or they may at some point in the road issue final guidelines based on the comments that were made. Implementation period after the final guidelines come out. It'll be time for labs to go through the qualifying process to become to do oral fluid testing. But and though the guidelines only apply right now to federal drug testing programs, that will not always be the situation. They will apply beyond that as well. So, to remind, we're going to get you slides so that access to them. Jessica's going to give you instructions in just a minute, and they're going to be you're going to have a recording as well. And I would strongly urge you, if you're going to submit comments, to review 200-page document, the proposed guidelines from the Federal Register. Now, we have a few questions here, and I've got a little bit of time. No, these proposed guidelines do not include hair testing at this time. Patricia did address the subject of hair testing, and that is a process that is underway. The Drug Testing Advisory Board is considering hair testing and what recommendations they'll make to SAMHSA on hair testing. They'll likely have to go through a similar process, right? So looking at hair testing sort of leapfrogging in front of oral fluid testing. For oral fluid testing to get to this point has taken years. Perhaps the process won't take quite as long to get to this point for hair testing, only because SAMHSA is in sort of a frame of mind to look at alternative testing methods. But it's not included in these proposed guidelines. Let me just look for maybe one more question. There are questions here on the collection process and, sort of mirroring the existing collection procedures for urine. Two things here. This was actually a big issue for SAMHSA and for the Drug Testing Advisory Board. You can tell reading the proposed guidelines, a lot of thought, discussion, debate went into that topic. I would please defer you to the entire document that's found in the Federal Register so that you can read for yourself. Again, bottom line is that they were trying to mirror the process that for protection of the sample, but the result is that can be defended. And that's the process, or that was the objective in the development of these particular guidelines when it was related to oral fluid testing. Some questions, so I defer you to that. There's a whole bunch. I'm just sort of scanning the questions while I'm talking. There's a bunch here. There are questions on the cutoff levels. Again, I would refer to the proposed guidelines. This is obviously an important issue, and what they were trying to do there was to sort of mirror cutoff levels that would, be consistent with the type of positivity rates you see from urine testing programs, and even that, as I pointed out earlier, just refer one study. A positivity rate with lab-based oral fluid testing was a little bit higher, and as said, they may be due to the users to cheat. You know what? I'm gonna turn this back over to Jessica, but let me just say that there are a lot of questions here. I'll get to all of them, and we'll send it out to everybody who was on today's webinar so that everybody can benefit from both question and the information that we provide as an answer to that question. But if you have a specific question, you weren't able to get to it, email me at bcurrent@currentconsultinggroup.com, bcurrent@currentconsultinggroup.com, or call and we'll provide an answer to your question. We'll do the best that we can. But the virtual microphone back over to Jessica, and once again, thank OraSure for hosting and sponsoring today's webinar presentation. Thank you.
Bill, and on behalf of OraSure Technologies, we hope that you found today's presentation and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions via email informing you how to access the recording. Thank you for your attendance today, and this concludes today's webinar.